Welcome everyone on this horribly humid and hot day. But I'm coming from New Haven, where we've had to only experience humidity for like the last week, and Washington is a swamp in many ways. So the humidity seems to rise here. So coming into town this morning, it was just like kind of hit me. First of all, my name is Abdurrahman Malik. I'm going to be the moderator, the facilitator of the discussion. I'm a postgraduate associate at the Council on Middle East Studies at Yale University, where I'm working on a number of different projects, including one hopefully with Dr. Peter Mandeville on Unthinking, Countering Violent Extremism policy, which we started last year. But my background is in journalism. I'm radio journalist for the British Broadcasting Corporation's World Service Radio and terrestrial radio. And for most of my life, and particularly for the last 15 years, been involved in organizing, particularly on-the-ground programs that sort of engage with Muslim communities on issues of building resilience to ideological and theological extremism. I think today's conversation is going to be incredibly rich, and I hope to be hearing many of the voices in the room, those are your voices, contribute to the conversations that are going to be taking place here on stage. In thinking about today and in thinking about this very important and I think significant report, the Islamic Tradition and Human Rights Discourse, I was reminded of a conference at the UNESCO headquarters that I was at probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And there was a session, a breakout session during that conference around religion and human rights. And I found myself as a kind of Muslim activist programmer in a room with theologians and academics. And I remember on one side of me was a Russian Orthodox priest who was kind of the point man for the Russian Orthodoxy on issues of contemporary human rights. And on the other side was a representative from the Vatican, also engaged. And what was interesting for me at that particular meeting was that as soon as we began discussing the notion of human rights, and particularly in the context of UNESCO, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and ways in which the Universal Declaration was being promoted or not promoted or engaged with by religious communities, I had these two Christian representatives of two wings of Christianity raising the most loud, at times obnoxious objections to not just human rights discourse, but the Universal Declaration of Human Rights itself. All of a sudden I felt like a bit of a hero. Usually it's the Muslims who are painted into that particular corner. But I'm happy to report we're not alone. And I think for me it was terribly revealing, because it kind of indicated that many of the issues which this particular report and this project has addressed are concerns, to put mildly, that are shared by other religious communities and other religious institutions. And I say that to start off with, not to mitigate the conversation or take it away from this discussion about the Islamic tradition and human rights discourse, but to say that I think these issues globally are written much larger than Islam or Muslim communities. And I think that, for me, as a moderator and facilitator of this discourse, is important to put out there. You may not agree with me, and feel free to disagree during the conversation. I look forward to your interventions. I want to start off with you, Hisham. Hisham Hellier, all of you know, is the non-resident senior fellow here at the Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East, and he's been sort of heading up this project here around religion and human rights at the Atlantic Council. Full disclosure, Hisham and I have been friends for many years, but as he will testify, our friendship has weathered many arguments and differences of opinion that we've had on so many issues. And I want to begin with you, Hisham. Tell us a little bit about the intentionality of this particular project. Why did you engage in this particular line of inquiry, especially given the fact that over the last, I would say, 3 decades, there's been a lot that's been written from a wide variety of interlocutors around Islam and human rights. We saw the Islamization movement that's been championed by organizations like IIIT and started by people like Ismail Farouqi, who have tried to sort of wed and mold human rights language onto the language of Islam. We've seen the work that individuals like Tariq Ramadan have taken on in terms of sort of wedding maqasid to human rights language, the maqasid of Sharia, the purposes, the higher purpose of Sharia to human rights language. Why this intervention? Why now? And why is it different?
Well, first, thank you very much, Abdurrahman, for first coming to DC and moderating this discussion, and thank you to the co-panelists for having taken time out of your busy schedules, and really to all of you. I'd like to welcome you all to the Atlantic Council. And unfortunately, the Carnegie Corporation of New York couldn't be here today. They were very generous in supporting this project. I'm very grateful to them. I do see our former colleague, Murat Mabrouk, who was our Director of Research, who was very instrumental in actually putting this forward, and of course, Toka Nusayrat and other colleagues from the Council, Sama Hamdani, without whom we would not be sitting here today. So I would like to recognize them and thank them very much. Now, to your question, and I think it's a very good question, you're correct. There have been a number of different attempts over not just the past few years, but the past few decades that look at this particular issue. But I think you point out quite aptly why we deemed it necessary to look in a slightly different way. The grafting on approach, we didn't feel, at least when I started looking at this particular topic, was particularly deep enough. It was taking a universe and almost like putting a round peg into a square hole. And what we thought was far more interesting was to really interrogate philosophically, but also practically, how these things work out in the real world. So the volume that has now been published is the result of actually many essays and many discussions over the course of the past year that haven't all been included here, but they take that imperative very seriously, looking at how these things work out in the real world, practically speaking, but also what rootedness and what authenticity they can actually bear, they can actually claim when it comes to the Islamic tradition. And we've taken different geographies, we've taken minority communities, majority communities. We haven't tried to make it, and I hope this is borne out in the collection, we haven't tried to make it as an accusation or even a final conclusion in really any way, but really bringing out these questions and trying to begin a discussion.
Your framing in your foreword to the report, I think, is really interesting, because you use very specific terminology, and the terminology is kind of mirrored in the title of the report. You really speak about this thing called the Islamic tradition, and then you speak about this thing called human rights discourse, and each, of course, has its own particular genealogies and histories.
Absolutely.
I think some might come to this report and say, Hisham, let's be honest. What you're trying to do here is rescue the Islamic tradition and make it relevant to this thing called the human rights discourse. And others, champions of the human rights discourse, some of them who may be in this room, may come to you and say, Hisham, let's be honest. What you're really trying to do here is rescue the human rights discourse from religious hegemony. Are you trying to do either of those?
Neither, to be honest, because although we did, and I think appropriately call this volume the Islamic Tradition and the Human Rights Discourse, this is really about how Muslims engage in that world. And Muslim communities, whether as minority populations or majority populations, if I can use that terminology, they exist in that sort of world, right? So whether we think about this positively or not, there are Muslim communities around the world that exist in a faith-based sort of framework, and they are impacted by this discourse. They participate in this discourse. They are sometimes the victims of the abuses of this discourse, and I found that personally very interesting to see how do they navigate that. And over the course of the past year, we had very interesting discussions with people who are theologians, organizations who recognize the claims of that discourse, and if they don't provide it with the same sort of validity that they do their own, they recognize its power and its influence. We had discussions with people who are very faithful to their tradition as Muslims and deeply embedded within human rights organizations, and trying to make sense of the world around them as they see huge amounts of abuses. We can talk about this in a minority context, whether we talk about the Rohingya, or more recently in China, or in a majority context. And there we have, unfortunately, a long list of countries that we could discuss over the past few years where human rights abuses within Muslim majority communities have been violated. And indeed, closer to home, speaking as a Brit, looking at Europe, looking at the rise of far-right populism and the impact of that, all of these things, I think, are very pertinent for us to try to look at as we understand that interchange between the universe of the Islamic tradition and the reality on the ground for people who draw on the human rights discourse, have every right to do so. And indeed, it's sometimes their own rescuing mechanisms. So, but rescuing either one of these discourses philosophically, I don't think that's really the point. But I do think that it's very important to see how Muslims and Muslim communities themselves are trying to rescue themselves.
I'm going to bring Professor Muhammad Fadl in on the discussion in just 1 second. But there's one thing that you raised there that I think is probably worth pushing on a little bit. Is that as you've gotten now to the end of this process, which I know has involved sort of hundreds of interviews and gatherings and meetings and so on, from which this collection is sort of drawn. Do you and I think the other thing that struck me was that the people you're engaging with in these conversations are religious scholars, are people from the academy, and then practitioners and activists. So people who are actively involved in human rights policy, implementing that policy, and making it have sort of value in the real world. As you come to the end of this particular chapter of this project, do you think that right now, and in sort of our contemporary moment, Islamic thought, whether coming from religious leadership or from the academy, has something to contribute to broader human rights discourse?
I most certainly do, but we have a huge obstacle in this regard, and that's that all of the discussions, and this was something that I try to bring out within the volume, all of these discussions, beginning from 9/11, but intensifying tremendously in 2011 after the Arab uprisings. All of these discussions have become securitized. Okay, so some people that we spoke to over the past year raised the issue of, in the past year or so, the specter of securitizing everything has come up. I said, no, not really. It's been going on for a very long time, and it's just become more and more intense. And unfortunately, the attraction of autocrats, whether in authoritarian states but also outside of authoritarian states, they find this very tempting, and we've seen a lot of legitimization of that in different contexts. So no, I think that there is something very valuable to be drawn from this discussion, but it happens against this backdrop, which really permeates through so much.
We're gonna come back to that last point, because I think that needs unpacking, and I'm going to bring Dalia and Peter to sort of help us through that. Many of you will know Dr. Muhammad Fadl, Associate Professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto. Those of us who are kind of Islamic law geeks, but have no real qualification to talk about Islamic law, have enjoyed Professor Fadl's work for many, many years. And one of the things that really struck me about your piece, Dr. Fadl, was that in a way you try to transcend the literature of apology, and as Peter put it in a private conversation, the literature of valorization. Around sort of this nexus between Islam and human rights, and bring us right back into legal theory. And I just want to quote something that you said in your piece, and I'd love for you to just kind of unpack it for us. You say that Islamic law can be reconciled to human rights law only to the extent that Muslims believe their desire to live as Muslims and not just quote unquote believe in Islam individually and as communities will be honored by human rights law. Conversely, human rights law will be comfortable with Islamic law only when it is convinced that Muslims genuinely respect the rights of non-Muslims to equal religious freedom and those of nominal Muslims to reject Islam and take seriously the cause of gender equality rather than using Islam as an excuse to defend the status quo. I thought that was a really fascinating formulation. I wonder if you could unpack it for us, especially in light of the argument that you make around the notion of freedom and how you feel that Islamic tradition and human rights discourse views the idea of freedom.
Well, I guess what I was trying to say generally in the piece is that the concerns of Islam and the concerns of human rights discourses are very, very different. So Islam is concerned about the way human beings live. So Islam wants to give a very specific conception to what it means to live a good life as a human being, whereas human rights discourse in its essence is about protecting people from the depredations of others, primarily a state, and not at all concerned about how people choose to live their lives, right? And so given the essentially different concerns of these two different discourses, it would be shocking if it turned out that there was complete overlap between the two, right? So given that, we have to think about, well, what exactly is the intelligent way of negotiating or trying to bring dialogue with these two different things. Now, when I say that Islam is concerned about giving people or teaching people a certain way of living, that doesn't mean it's indifferent to rights, or it doesn't mean that it's indifferent to protecting people from abuse. But with the kinds of things that Islam will consider to be a right or an abuse is going to be contingent, or is going to be instrumentally related to the kinds of goods that Islam encourages human beings to pursue, right? And so those goods might be conceived very differently. Well, excuse me, those goods are very thick, whereas in human rights discourses, the goods that are being pursued are very thin, so to speak.
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, so for example, Islam has a very clear conception of what marriage is all about. That marriage exists to reproduce the Muslim community, right? So therefore that restricts the potential marriage partners. It structures the entire relationship around this other end, right? It creates certain rights and obligations in light of these goals that it believes that marriage is supposed to fulfill, right? So the happiness of the spouses is one factor, but it's certainly not the only one, right? Whereas human rights discourse is not concerned about that at all, because it doesn't have a conception of marriage as a thick thing other than sort of the personal autonomy of the parties to it, right? So obviously there's going to be some kind of tension in between in these two different areas, because the conceptions of what's at stake are very different. That doesn't mean that there aren't areas of overlap. But the problem that I see from the Muslim perspective is that there's a kind of, if I could use the term, human rights inflation, in which human rights goes beyond a core of protecting the individual from interferences by the government, right, into an attempt to change the way people live in such a way that undermines the capacity of groups like Muslims to reproduce themselves over time, right? So I think CEDAW is an excellent example of this. CEDAW is very broad in its language, right? It doesn't deal with discrimination against women solely by the government, nor does it even deal with discriminations in the private business sector. But by its own terms, it reaches into every aspect of social life, right? The idea being that any kind of gender discrimination in any area of society inevitably undermines the cause of gender equality everywhere, right? Now, I think this creates a huge problem for a religious community like Islam, in which gender is clearly a salient category, right? It's one thing to talk about, I think, gender equality in the workplace and in political rights. It becomes a completely different problem from an Islamic perspective to talk about gender equality in ritual, right, which is sort of the core of religion, and revelation, for example, uses gender as an express category, right? And so this kind of, again, inflation of human rights in such a way that it threatens to eliminate the autonomy of the private sphere and associational freedom, I think leads a lot of Muslims to conclude that accepting any part of the human rights discourse means giving up religious freedom entirely, right? And so there's a lot of wholesale rejection of the concept of human rights on the theory that you're going down a road that will end up destroying your capacity to teach your own beliefs, right?
So, one could read that as a very depressing analysis. What then is the prognosis, or how do you feel the conversation?
This is why I sort of concluded where I did, was that the human rights community has to understand that there has to be some kind of internal limit to human rights that does not entail the incapacitation of other sorts of freedoms, like religious freedom and freedom of association, right? Until they recognize that, then I think it's impossible to believe that, Muslims as a community, and maybe other religious communities too, I don't want to speak for other religions, will be able to see anything valuable in the human rights discourse. Conversely, I think Muslims should understand that lots of human rights claims and critiques of traditional Islamic teachings are not necessarily so open-ended as would lead to the internal destruction of the community as a coherent community, right? And so though I highlighted those 2 points, right, because even though I think CEDAW represents a case of human rights inflation, there are a whole vast areas in Muslim societies in which there should be absolutely zero objection to gender equality, right? Like I was talking about the workplace and political rights, et cetera, et cetera. And so both discourses have to understand, I think, the internal limits to religion on one side and the internal limits on human rights on the other. Otherwise, there's sort of no...
There's a lot to pick up from there, and Dali, I'm going to come to you in just a moment. But to push that one step further, Dr. Fadl, do you think that the way, I think there's a broad critique about how the ways in which the Islamic tradition and human rights discourse have been engaged thus far, and I sometimes wonder, as you're talking about the way in which this conversation is playing out now, and some of the fault lines and some of the inabilities to reconcile or to find a way forward, unless we're willing to make some kind of compromise. The issue of kind of utilitarian use of human rights discourse also comes up. So there seems to be, in this particular moment, for example, by certain Muslim actors, a co-optation of a human rights language because it has currency and it makes sense. It is not necessarily something that's intellectually been thought through or philosophically reconciled, but there's a kind of the use of it because it serves a political purpose in the moment.
Well, I don't think that that's a bad thing. I think it shows the extent to which there actually is a great deal of convergence on certain basic ideas of what it means to be a human being and what kind of rights human beings require. It's just there's a tendency, I think, among certain groups in the, let's say, the religionist camp and certain groups in the human rights camp to absolutize their discourse, right? And I don't view this as a compromise. I think it's a mistaken understanding of human rights discourse on the one hand and religious freedom on the other, right? So I think that from the human rights perspective, gender equality, for example, has to be one value that it coexists with other values. It can't be the supreme value, right? Same thing in sort of Islamic ethics. The ability to reproduce the community is one value, but it can't be the only value, right? It has to coexist with other values, right? And so it's a question of reconciling different commitments within each tradition in a proper way. But to making one value the supreme value over all else is an erroneous reading of each tradition and leads to unnecessary conflict, in my view.
I think that's a vitally important point. I hope some of you will pick that up. And it brings me to Dalia. Dr. Dalia Fahmy is an associate professor of political science at Long Island University. You can read her bio. She addresses issues from foreign policy to Islamic political movements, and her forthcoming book is called The Rise and Fall of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Future of Political Islam. Dr. Fahmy, before we kind of came on stage, we were kind of addressing this last point that Dr. Fadl makes, which is sort of around terminology. And I know in your piece in this volume, you address that. And it's one of those kind of the square recommendations that you make, is that there needs to be kind of a reckoning between competing terminologies and definitions. Picking up where sort of Dr. Fadl left off, could you expand on that? Because I think it sort of leads us to one of the quagmires of the current conversation.
So I think I move in a bit of a different direction,
Please.
but hopefully I'll return to what Dr. Fadl was saying in a second. So I come at this as a social scientist, so in a different way, not an Islamic studies scholar. And so what we've seen in the past 2 years is that the anti-Muslim sentiment that used to exist in the periphery is now coming from the core of the political establishment. And so my piece is about the rise of the alt-right and the mainstreaming of anti-Muslim narrative. And it's interesting that for so long, when we talk about minority communities all over the world, but especially in the Middle East, the expectation was that there would be these great declarations, like the Marrakesh Declaration, about what does it mean to protect minority communities, religious minority communities. And it doesn't just have to come from the state, but it must come from the religious establishment. But when we come back to the United States, why are the same standards not upheld? And so we don't hear the same expectations coming from religious minorities here in the United States. And so my question about the standardization of language, why is it that we assume and request certain religious leadership to make certain declarations and don't expect it from those in, for example, here in the United States? Why do we not expect the evangelicals to issue statements about the mainstreaming of anti-Muslim sentiment? So it's really about the standardization of language, the standardization of how we collect data. And so, in this realm of the vernacular and social science, why is it that we apply certain standards to the Middle East and to Muslim majority countries about protections of minority rights and do not apply the same standards here in the United States?
I guess then the question becomes, do you feel like, running with that analysis, there does seem to be a turn away from human rights discourse. Our discourse around citizenship and belonging is far more atomized, individual, and siloed. There's a discourse of sort of nationalist-driven civic rights. I'm thinking recently about the proposal in Denmark to give two-tier citizenship to individuals who are literally growing up in geographically, quote-unquote, ghettoed populations who are children of migrants themselves. This seems like a fundamental blow to everything that we know to be, quote-unquote, sacred in human rights discourse. Are we just seeing a global turn away from human rights, and does our strategy and our language then need to change to defend the rights, civic or human, that minority or marginalized communities deserve for their own self-protection, frankly?
So if we look at U.S. policy, so for example, first let's take U.S. foreign policy. If you follow the General Assembly debates, but especially the presentations of our presidents over the past couple of discussions. So President Obama, when he first became president, led with the human rights discourse. He led with President Bush's previous, the kind of humanity, the freedom discourse at the United Nations. But it wasn't until President Obama's second to last General Assembly address where we moved away from the human rights discourse, and he said, our interest in for example, Muslim majority countries, but especially in the Middle East, are still the security of Israel, flyover rights over Sinai, and economic cooperation, and of course, counterterrorism. And that's where we will put the full force of our military. And that's his terminology. But when it comes to human rights and democratic aspirations of people, this was right after the Arab Spring, these are things that we can negotiate. And that's what President Obama said. And if we look at what the current foreign policy is, and again, we don't have a coherent foreign policy towards Muslim majority countries, but there's no longer the discourse of human rights and democratization or even democratic preconditions in our, for example, giving to foreign aid. But if you bring it back to the domestic, and it's not just Muslim ban 1, 2, 3, and finally the one that was just codified by or approved by the Supreme Court. If we look at the mainstreaming of anti-Muslim sentiment and anti-immigrant sentiment in the past couple of elections, it started not just with the run-up to President Obama's election, but in 2010 midterm election, we saw the hysteria around Muslims be the way with which you can actually normalize anti-Muslim bigotry in this country, and for the most part, people will be silent, and you can win an election. And this came around the so-called Ground Zero mosque hysteria in New York. So I'm in New York, and the Ground Zero Park 51 is not at Ground Zero, and it's not a mosque. And it was the summer of hysteria up until a midterm election. And once the elections happens, what happened? The conversation goes away. Park 51 is still there. 2012, we saw a very similar set of policies. The attempt to pass anti-Sharia legislation in over 24 states. Again, it was never about passing the legislation. It was about creating a culture of hysteria around Muslims, around this impending fear. Historically, the Muslim other, before 9/11, was a member of the PLO, some Libyan terrorists. But now when the suspect communities within the United States, you can actually push for policies that not only lead to unequal citizenship, but actually codify, like in the Muslim ban, the marginalization of certain groups. Yes, North Korea and Venezuela were included, but when was the last time you saw a North Korean passport in the United States? So let's not kid ourselves.
Is it then that we've deluded ourselves? That we're a society that really doesn't take human rights seriously as a discourse, as a principle of what it means to live democratically and live together.
So much of the civil society literature we have on the Middle East says the Arab street is not comfortable with human rights.
Is the American street also
uncomfortable? And so the question
with human
becomes,
rights?
and this goes to the standardization of language, is the American street comfortable with equality and human rights? And so, in some of my more recent writing, I've been turning language on itself, right? Is the American street, or the American masses, is this mob mentality, right? The anti-women's rights that we start to see, the mainstreaming of misogyny, right? We have 54% of college-educated white women in America vote for misogynists, right? When we talk about women in the Middle East, we use that kind of language. So is the question that the entire world is not comfortable with human rights and equality? We are starting to see the racialization of communities, right? So it's not just Muslims, it's anyone who's brown, it's Sikh Indians, right? It's Mexicans, it's Hispanics. We are all a new category that does not deserve equal rights in this country, and much of mainstream America is agreeing.
I'm certain we're going to come back to this. Peter, I want to finally bring you in on the conversation. Lots for you to pick up. Peter Manville is professor of international affairs at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, but has worn in the last year many hats. The hat of the academic in the ivory tower, of the researcher in the Muslim and not so Muslim streets, but also as a member of various policy and implementation teams in the U.S. government, particularly in the administration of Secretary Clinton and Kerry at the State Department. Peter, there's a lot that we can come at you with, but let's first go back to and I think Dr. Fahmy really set the stage for us in terms of Obama's Cairo speech and what happened afterwards in terms of the way we were looking at the quote-unquote Muslim world through this lens of human rights. We've come to kind of there was a moment there wasn't there on the quote-unquote Arab street where even those movements of political Islam that you've studied intensely were giving lip service to the language of human rights, were talking about human rights, were speaking about the future of their nations and the future of democracy and citizen engagement through the language of human rights. And then we had the election in Egypt and then the counter-revolution. Was that just lip service and convenient language? In as much as the language of reform coming out of places like Saudi Arabia today is also sort of just convenient reformist language without any real underpinnings in significant changes to the way in which human rights are respected or not.
So, I mean, I think that in both cases, Abdurrahman, around the Arab uprisings and some of the more hopeful receptions of the proposals that we hear coming from the mouth of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, there's a lot of different parties hearing what they want to hear and projecting onto these individuals and these events things that they would like to see. You know, when Hisham told me about this project, and I should, in full disclosure, also a charter member of the Hisham Hellier fan club, which is why I can say what I'm about to say. When he told me he was doing this project, I said, oh my God, not again, seriously? We're gonna have this conversation again, Islam and human rights? Habibi, we've been through this. We've done this many times, right? Through the 70s, 80s, 90s, the work of, you know, people like Muhammad Hashim Kamali, you know, Aziz Al-Hibri, my Mason colleague Abdulaziz Sashadina, I mean, went through this in great detail, and I think brought us to a point of, you know, I'd characterize it as stable tension, right? Minimal, workable interoperability, right? That says, like, look, no, there's not complete convergence between, you know, the Islamic tradition and human rights discourse, but there's enough points of plug-in that we can make this work. And you know, I think that Professor Fadl's contribution to the report, which I would, you know, impress upon all of you to read, the final paragraph of it does a magisterially efficient job of sort of capturing the crux of that workable tension, which is the idea that, you know, in human rights discourse, regardless of its pretenses of universality, it has a genealogy in its codification and instantiation in international law. It has a certain liberal genealogy at its core, which means that it is first and foremost focused on advancing a particular conception of the autonomous individual, right? Whereas the Islamic tradition and conceptions of rights that exist within it are primarily about advancing a particular conception of religious normativity, which requires the configuration of social institutions and practices in certain ways. So there's always going to be, you know, a certain kind of tension, and trying to have conversations about whether one is compatible with the other isn't going to get us very far. I think we got there, but I think there is a good reason to be having this conversation now, and I think there's a reason that there's true added value that comes to us from this report. One is that, you know, as Professor Fahmy has pointed out, there's been a lot of water under the bridge since those earlier debates in terms of the record of world events and things that have happened. The Arab uprising certainly, but the rise of various forms of populist politics in many quarters of the world, you know, entailing various forms of exclusionary identity politics and debates about who precisely has rights, you know, who's allowed to claim rights and what sorts of status those people have. So there's a lot there. There's also, I think, there's an interesting symmetry that's been emerging in a number of debates in other religious traditions, right? When I look at some of the terms of the debates that surround, for example, the Hobby Lobby case, the situation around the baker and the wedding cake here in the United States, the structure of those arguments, you know, bear an interesting resemblance to and pick up on some of the same categories that have structured precisely the debates that Professor Fadl was referring to as well. So I think there's now an opportunity for sort of an interesting comparative and broader discussion that's not just about Islam and human rights, but about human rights and religiosity. And religiosity in the world more broadly, right? And this kind of keys on the last gig that I had at the State Department, which was this office that former Secretary Kerry created, the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, created precisely out of a recognition that religion, far from the way secularization theories would suggest, religion was not going away, but was you know, an incredibly important social force in many societies around the world. And so we needed to figure out how to feel our way through these kinds of debates and discussions. And finally, if it, and this is, I think, an overarching point that kind of contains all of these earlier, more specific events that we've just mentioned recently in it. If it is indeed the case, as some contend, that we are moving into something like a post-liberal world order, right? And I'm not just talking about the idea that we have emerging powers and Russia and India and China, and that there will be some effect there on global norms. The United States itself seems to be withdrawing, as Professor Fahmy mentioned, from the space of human rights. If we are moving into a post-liberal world order, then it is worth revisiting discussions about conceptions of humanity, values, and rights, because we may be moving into a time where those debates gain a new currency.
Maybe it's the young man in me who read a lot of Marxism, but I want to come back to your point about power and agency.
Yeah.
Because I think it's one of the things that Dr. Fahmy you kind of alluded to, is that where does the power behind this discourse and these conversations lie? The power within the conversation, but also the power to shape the conversation from the outside.
Yes.
Could you unpack that with us? Because you mentioned it just in passing.
Yeah.
But I heard it.
Yeah.
I heard power and I heard agency.
Yeah. I mean, I think.
And where do you see that?
Yeah.
Where do you see the fault lines of power and agency in these conversations?
I mean, I'd go to Gramsci, I think, rather than Marx here, right? And sort of just a conception of hegemony, right? That there's this unspoken assumption that a liberal conception of human rights is a natural conception of human rights, and therefore that any tradition that would purport to be valued and recognized needs to somehow prove its bona fides. That anybody wanting to be at that table has to prove that they don't have a lack, that there's an absence. And so the sort of post-colonial legacy that lies behind all of this can't be written out of the picture. I think for so long, and again, Professor Fadel alludes to this at the beginning of his piece as well, that for so long, so much of the discourse of Muslim intellectuals in the second half of the 20th century, and frankly before that, in the middle of the 19th century, the latter part of the 19th century, was about this idea that no, Islam has human rights and democracy too. We have all those things. It's not just the West that has that. We have all that, and some version of those debates and discussions continued well into the 20th century. There are frankly hints of it still in certain pieces that are present in this report. So deep.
It reminds me of Recep Sentuk's piece,
yes,
in particular, and
yes,
your point resonates with that.
Yes, and so this continues to be that legacy continues to be at the heart of all of this.
Last question, and I think Dr. Fahmy has an interjection. We'll get into a conversation. We'll bring in the audience in a moment. When this point is made about that in the post-Arab Spring period, the United States administration and policymakers were willing to put human rights on the table as a negotiating piece, how would you respond to that? And if that's true, then we're getting unduly angry at this particular administration, because the seeds for that kind of negotiating away of human rights started much earlier.
I have some real misgivings with respect to the way that the administration that I served in handled a lot of this. I mean, I think even the sequence of events from President Obama's Cairo speech onwards, which at one level was meant to be an effort to kind of rehumanize the Muslim in the aftermath of the Bush administration, I think actually served to reproduce a logic of exceptionalism around Islam, because suddenly there was these things called Muslims in the world, that we had to have special envoys and special representatives to engage them, and we had to have programs, we had to bureaucratize that Muslim and throw funding at various initiatives to turn them into entrepreneurs and researchers and things like that. It was strange because it had a public relations, public diplomacy thrust to it that was trying to make nice with the Muslim, in a sense. Make nice with the global Muslim. But what it did was to actually, at some level, reproduce this idea that there's something different and exceptional about those Muslims that mean they need special handling. Yeah. Whereas I would think that if you're really trying to redress the damage that the Bush administration had done, the correct gesture would be to normalize and treat those Muslims the same way you treat everyone else, regardless of what religious faith they happened to hold to. With respect to the way that we handled the challenge of, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood in the aftermath of the Arab uprisings, this was the issue that I worked on most closely. I was someone who for a long time had been pushing for the importance of engagement with a group like the Ikhwan in Egypt. Not because I adhered to or appreciated their politics. I suspect that I personally would not like to live in the society that they would like to create. But because as someone sitting in an institution driven by realpolitik, they are relevant. You have to recognize their role at the table, that they're going to be part of the equation, and you have to be able to transact with them, to do business with them. So that minimal engagement is necessary. What worried me was the moment that that engagement was authorized, there seemed to be something like a rush to embrace. Like, oh, these are the new guys we're going to do business with. And so they're big, they're into entrepreneurship and business, and so we can do all kinds of cool things with them and that, which was very worrying to me because there were things that the administration of Mohamed Morsi was doing in the line of human rights where we needed to have been asking very hard questions, right? For me, engagement with the Ikhwan was meant to be also a platform that we could use to raise very serious concerns that we had about their particular understanding of what minority rights would mean, right? So I think some of our diplomats would meet with them and they'd hear Ikhwan people say things like, oh yes, minority rights are very important, and they tick the box. Oh yeah, they like minority rights, tick. Oh, the rights of women, yes, very important. Oh, they said women's rights, tick that box, without pushing further and asking harder questions about what particular understanding, conception of what minority rights, what does that mean to you, and what does that look like?
Dr. Fahmy, would you agree that the policy of the previous administration now carried forward created this sense of exceptionalism, which frames this discussion about the Islamic tradition, human rights in a very particular way?
We can also argue it started under Bush's freedom agenda towards the Middle East. But I want to push back a little, and I can't believe I would do this because that's Peter Mandeville. Are the standards that we hold all parties and all nations the same? And so when we have this kind of boxes we're checking, do we hold everyone accountable? Germany has yet to recognize Islam as a religion, right? And so my issue is, why are there different standards? One of the mistakes, or many of the mistakes the Muslim Brotherhood did, this is even before they came into power, and we saw this reflected in that leaked draft party platform in 2007, was, they talked about human rights, yes, they talked about women's rights, but in very arcane terms, right? So they did the check box, but used very kind of Western language and put it, like you said, square peg, square hole, but almost reifying that human rights and Islam are two separate things that only the West could put into conversation with one another. And so yes, so there is a kind of suspect of, do you really understand what codifying minority rights and human rights does? But why is it that there's a different standard when we talk to parties who espouse a Muslim or religious platform in the Middle East? And so that's still my sticking point.
Peter, I'm going to allow you a quick response. I want to come to Hisham. Go ahead.
Well, I guess what I was trying to get at was the idea that even though in the public statements of the administration which I was serving, there was this idea that now after the Arab uprisings, we will take democracy and human rights seriously because we understand that our policy in the Middle East cannot just be driven by security considerations. In the absence of democracy and human rights, there will be no security. That was the public line. But I think in the realm of more private, behind-the-scenes diplomatic engagement, there was something like, at least as I saw it, a rush to see how quickly we could get back to the previous way of doing business with the Egyptian government, where so long as they say some of the right kinds of things, you don't ask hard questions and look very closely at what they're doing, because you just want to make sure that they're giving you overflight rights and access to the Suez Canal and all the right kind of intelligence about terrorism. And so that the idea that there was this heavy embrace of democracy and human rights by the United States on the part of the Arabs and the aftermath of the Arab Spring, and now a Trump administration pulling away from it, I'm not sure that the Obama administration's credentials in the democracy and human rights side of things are actually that strong.
Hisham, I'm going to bring in one moment Once we get the short intervention from Hisham and Dr. Fadl, we're going to come to you. Traditional question-answer sessions are dull and boring. So questions, comments, and concerns, feel free to posit an intervention. Feel free to jump in with a statement. That's cool. Please keep your interventions short, sharp, and pithy. And we'll take about 3 or 4 at once, and then allow the panel to kind of throw them around a bit. So we're going to come out to you in just a moment. Hisham, I know you want to pick up on this a little bit, but I also want to take this one step further, and particularly focus on the Islamic tradition lens of this post-Arab Spring dilemma, and the way in which, sort of as a case study, the way in which human rights language and discourse was handled. If in the aftermath of the Sisi counter-revolution and the removal of the Morsi government, there was clearly the support of the religious establishment for that particular political action broadly. And so I wonder, and I think this comes down to almost your aspiration in this project of engaging with religious scholarship. To what extent is religious scholarship, not only do they have the chops, but are they even relevant to this conversation, given that their track record is pretty poor? And if they are relevant to the conversation, then which aspects of religious scholarship and religious leadership are relevant? Because it's certainly not all.
So when we look at how religious establishments in the Arab world reacted to the Arab uprisings, first, I think there's an impression that all of them acted the same, and I don't think that's accurate. I think if you look at how different parts of the Syrian religious establishment reacted, it's quite a complex story. Even within Egypt, I think that's also true. There's certainly very prominent voices that established themselves as sort of bearing the mantle, right? But whether or not that's true is a very questionable and at least contested sort of idea, because by its very nature, silence is not contested, right? So when silence happens, it simply means that the loudest voices then take control of the discussion. And I think you had different voices within different religious establishments. I'm thinking really about 3 countries here. I'm thinking about Libya, I'm thinking about Syria, and I'm thinking about Egypt. And I think that there were different voices that expressed themselves either in support of this political transition, or this political transition, or this overthrow, or this coup, etc. And the discussions do actually evolve. Now the questions that I had really, and this didn't come up in any of the essays that we managed to get. It did come up a lot in discussions, especially when you had human rights activists who were deeply faithful to their religion and expressed it as such in some of these countries. And the discussions around the religious establishment I found really fascinating, because on the one hand, the question of consistency came up a lot. Okay, the question of consistency came up a lot. And it didn't just come up, by the way, in terms of religious figures that expressed support for autocracies that were anti-Islamist. It also came up in terms of religious figures that expressed support for political Islamist movements that were not committed to what they saw as appropriate actions. So there were those 2 things, okay? There was also the question of whether or not religious arguments were being repackaged and reused in a contemporary context, which is what a lot of people call for, right? But without taking into account really how things had changed so much in the past, not just 10, 20, but 100 or 200 years, and using ideas and notions that made sense 200 years ago given a certain political and social context, but had changed dramatically. When we talk about the state in the 21st century, it's very easy for people to think that notion of state has been around for a very long time. It hasn't. It hasn't. So the duties and the rights and the responsibilities of those in positions of authority how they were even able to apply that authority has changed dramatically. And one thing that we try to do, it's come out in some of the papers, is how you see this notion of power, of state power, the amount of scope that people in power have over the general lives of the citizenry, the very notion of citizenship. All of these things I felt were very important for people to try to unpackage. And it's difficult, right? And that plays in a lot when it comes to religious establishment. Now, on the one hand, people can make the argument that, well, in that case, none of this is relevant. Okay, these guys are out of date. These guys have no concept of what the modern world is about, or the contemporary world is about. So let's just ignore it. I don't think that's practical. On one level, I don't think it's practical at all, because I think that people do listen to the parts of the religious establishment that they like, right? So that's one aspect of it. But also, it's not terribly new for religious establishments, whether in the Muslim context, but also in a more broader sense, to take some time to sort of catch up. And when it comes to Muslim religious establishments, particularly within the Arab world, but also elsewhere, the impacts of the colonial era and the post-colonial era, which sometimes I think was actually far more destructive, has really taken its toll. And I think that you see signs of this being challenged in different places, and then in other places you see signs of them actually not realizing it even took place. That the rate of change wasn't as much. And I was trying to get at this in one of the papers that we had, where the rate of change between, let's say, the year 1000 and 1100 is this much. That same rate of change can happen today in the space of 5 years. Okay, so the trying to really get at that, I thought was really important. I don't think, by the way, and I want to make this very clear, I don't think that we've come to final conclusions on any of these points.
Right.
And that wasn't the point of the project. The point was to raise the questions, do some exploration, and see where we can continue that conversation.
Dr. Fadl, just very quickly on this point around sort of the investigation of sort of the Islamic tradition. I mean, so much of your work is around sort of trying to understand the Islamic tradition in this contemporary context. Do you think that in light of what's been said so far, that the prognosis for that discourse, for this conversation, is hopeful, given the kind of the challenges that Hisham has laid out in terms of Islamic scholarship today, or the state of Islamic scholarship at present?
Well, I mean, first of all, I guess to a certain extent I'm an intellectual historian, so I'm a bit biased in like what I do, because I like doing it, I like arguments, I take good arguments very seriously, and I like to pan bad arguments, but I don't know how relevant that is to practical life. I think a lot of people are perfectly capable of recognizing and supporting rights and not articulate a very good theory as to why, right? And I think that may be the case with lots of Islamist movements. I think actually I give a lot more credit to their statements than others, insofar as, I just look at the level of human rights abuses between 2011 and 2013 and post-2013, right? So they may not have a very good theory about why apostates should not be killed, right? Their justifications might be completely, from an intellectual perspective, not very satisfying. But I think in Egypt there was greater religious freedom between 2011 and 2013 than there is now. And so there's a certain time lag between practical politics and theoretical justification, which I think people should recognize. And I think if we're not optimistic about that, where would we find optimism? I mean, the alternative is sheer barbarism, right? And if you look at somebody like Mohammed bin Salman, right? There is no pretense, right, of human rights at all. I mean, if it were so easy and it were so meaningless to say, yes, we support, women's rights, or we support political freedom, right? And it was costless to do this, then why doesn't he do it, right? So the thing is, even if you don't generally aren't committed to something in some sort of deep philosophical way, if you repeat it enough, right, it takes on a life of its own, right? That's why the Arab counter-revolution is so thoroughly committed to uprooting any notion of right whatsoever, so that people feel they have no rights at all, except bare life.
And I guess that the
right?
notion of reform has been totally divorced from the notion of rights. Is
That
that what you're
everything that
suggesting?
you should, anything given to you, you should be grateful for, which is the complete opposite of any conception of right. So if you're not going to find optimism in the Islamic discourse on human rights, then there's really nothing to hope for in the Arab world, as far as I can tell.
We're gonna. Oh, I love it. Let's see hands already. So I see the first hand there, the second there, and the third there, and then we'll take and then we'll come into another round. If you could just very briefly just introduce yourself so we know who you are, and short, sharp, and pithy. Take it away.
Sure, thank you very much. I'm Barbara Slavin. I direct a program on Iran here at the Atlantic Council. And next Thursday morning, we're having an event on Iran human rights, for those of you who are interested. Dr. Fahmy, I was fascinated by this double standard notion that you raised and wanted the panel to comment on how the US government has weaponized human rights to criticize those countries it's angry with for other reasons, and then very conveniently ignores problems with those that we're allied with. And I think we see that very obviously now with MBS in Saudi Arabia, barely a peep about what he's doing. And yet Secretary Pompeo is tweeting. Every time Iran arrests somebody, I see a tweet from Secretary Pompeo. And also the impact of Turkey, because many of us were so excited by the Turkish experiment. It looked like this was going to be a real model for religious freedom. Islam could be reintegrated into Turkish life in a very satisfying way. And now Turkey has more journalists in jail than any other country in the world. So
Thank you, Barbara.
the rise and fall of Turkey. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Right in front of you.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Peter Humphrey, I'm an intel analyst and a former diplomat. I noticed that there are a couple of hard nuts to crack because they're in the Quran or in the Hadith. Examples of the Jizra, 2 witnesses in the case of women, although last month Tunisia said no to that, interestingly. To me, the bigger question is Islam's very selective discussions about human rights. I have never, and I've looked very hard for this, found a statement from any predominantly Muslim government condemning the behavior of North Korea. Not one. We've had 50 years to condemn North Korea, and not a single Muslim country has made a case for it. And this is more problematic even within Islam. If it doesn't concern a problem in Palestine, it gets no attention. A dead Palestinian is worth 100 times a dead Rohingya, which is worth 20 times a dead Uyghur. And what's that about?
Thank you. And just back there, Mr. Bazargar.
Hi there. Abbas Barzgar, visiting researcher with Georgetown University and now Director of Research and Advocacy at the Council of American Islamic Relations. On the practical implementation of some of these attempts to reconcile Islam and human rights discourses, Dr. Fadl, you say that you're an intellectual historian, and so the bridge to the practical may not be there, but as a historian also and as an anthropologist, I'm sure that you've seen that on the ground, these contradictory discourses or irreconcilable discourses seem to really play themselves out quite seamlessly in institutions of the judiciary across the Muslim world and in different sectors. You could take the judiciary in Iran, for example, has kind of blended these things in odd ways. Anthropologists have seen that. We've seen Islamic finance and economics sort of blend capitalist and idealistic models. And my own work on the Muslim humanitarian sector over the last couple of years has shown very clearly that practitioners across the board, Christian, secular, and Muslim, seemingly have no confusion about the rights of human beings when it comes to forced migration, when it comes to refugee rights, et cetera. They're really in line. So what is it that we're missing at the policy and academic level that the practitioners seem to understand?
Three really pertinent interventions. Thank you very much. Let's start with Barbara's initial intervention. I think that came to you, Dr. Fahmy. I think one maybe footnote to add is that the interesting thing I think about this report is that it does, and we were speaking about this earlier, Hisham, it has a Sunni bias, and I think I would be interested in hearing about the Shi'i discourses around human rights, given that Shi'i scholarship has been a lot more open to sort of engaging more broadly with postmodern political and intellectual thought. I think it'd be interesting to see where some of the conversations are within Shi'i discourses, not only in Iran and Iraq, but in South Asia and elsewhere. So that's just a footnote to what you're saying. Dr. Fahmy, weaponizing of the double standard. I think it's a very important conceptualization. What do you make of that?
The weaponization of the human rights discourse is the same as it was with the weaponization of the women's rights discourse, right? We were saving Afghan women from the Taliban. And that was the pretext for war almost, right? Along with 9/11, but there was the language that we were seeing in the news and on TV and from policymakers were about the liberation of women, right? And it was coming from the same congressmen, for example, from Texas, who were trying to strip American women from reproductive rights. And so again, it was the weaponization of women's rights. We saw it again in the Iraq war with, the rewriting of personal status laws in Iraq, which stripped women in Iraq of rights that even under Saddam they had. And so this is not new. It's just a new face to the game. To the gentleman in front of you, there's a big difference between Muslim majority countries and Muslim countries. We have yet to see a Muslim country. And so Muslim majority countries are countries that have a Muslim majority. There's just like there are Christian majority countries. Do we hold the United States accountable for selling weapons to Saudi Arabia to drop them on Yemen? It's a Christian majority nation. Muslim majority nations need to be held to the same standards. Does that mean anyone is right? No, they are all wrong. And so I think when we, again, I'm sorry that I'm going to be a thorn in the side of everyone as long as I can be about the standardization of language, but Muslim majority countries commit really atrocious acts. But that's not necessarily reflective on Islam.
Peter, I want to bring you in, then Mohammed, and Hisham. Go ahead.
Just very briefly on the weaponization of rights issues. Obviously, it's nothing new, right? Diplomacy has always made very selective use of rights. Sure, and the United States, but the current U.S. administration is just so far beyond the realm of conventional practice around this, right? It's a time-honored tradition almost of 20th century American diplomacy that certain governments in the Middle East get not a pass, but there are times when we just read the minimal talking points and say nothing more, or we choose not to raise the rights issue. But in the case of the Trump administration, right, before President Trump goes to Saudi Arabia, May of 2017, he essentially openly says, we don't care about rights anymore. That's not going to be an element. You don't need to worry anymore. Carte blanche, go for it, is effectively what is heard in places like Riyadh. And that, I think, is deeply worrying.
Mohammed, I'm going to come to you and next. To address that question, but also to address
yes,
the second question,
I want to address
about the hard nut of the Quran, and this notion that in Islam there's very selective discussions about human rights, and that there are scriptural problems present. Go ahead.
I didn't hear the first part of your question, so maybe we can talk afterwards. But the second part, I think part of this issue is you have to understand the ideology of sovereignty in post-colonial Muslim states, right? The fundamental conception of sovereignty shared by Muslim post-colonial independent Muslim states is the inviolability of sovereignty and non-interference in domestic affairs, right? This is sort of the core principle that they all espouse, right? So even in the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, this is a fundamental principle, non-interference in domestic affairs, right? So I would be shocked, frankly, if they said anything about any country, except where there's some kind of Islamic dimension to it because of popular pressure. But as a general matter, right, they hold uniformly that states should not be commenting on what's going on domestically in other states, period, full stop. That's what it means to be sovereign, right? And so I think I personally have a very hard time accepting that as a categorical principle. I think that's fine if a state is acting lawfully, but if a state is acting illegally, much less, genocidally, then I think it forfeits its right to non-interference. But that's sort of my opinion. But I think that's one of the reasons why you will look long and hard to find any criticisms in North Korea, because non-interference in domestic affairs is a bedrock principle of the post-colonial Muslim state system. Period. Now, weaponization, I think it goes back, the whole distinction between the civilized and the non-civilized, right? And we see that, unfortunately, human rights is being appropriated to recreate a distinction between the civilized world and the non-civilized world. And if you're in the non-civilized world, the implication is we don't have to treat you with any right at all, basically. So we can kill you, we can invade you, we can do all sorts of things because you are not civilized. Therefore, you're not entitled to demand the rights that you would of a civilized nation, right? And this is what makes it so dangerous, and I think what makes human rights such a problem from a practical perspective, that even, there's this kind of the ever-changing goalpost, right? So, 20 years ago, same-sex marriage was not considered a human right. Now it is. So if you don't have it, you're not civilized, and we can do anything to you, right? So I think Dan Gold famously said, now we can put the peace process into the deep freezer until Palestinians are Finns, nobody's going to care, right? And so it's just the old imperialist distinction between the civilized and the non-civilized, unfortunately.
Abbas, we haven't forgotten about your question, but I want to bring Hisham in on this particular conversation. Then we will get to you and open another round. Go ahead,
Sure.
Hisham.
I just wanted to add 2 points when it comes to this issue of, speaking about the Uyghurs and Rohingya. And I think you raise a very good point, but there are at least two elements here that I would throw into that discussion, even with yourself. The first is about representation, and the second is about capacity. Okay, and I don't mean capacity in terms of, what could they do, but capacity of the ordinary citizen to actually be able to take even the measures of what we consider to be normal public pressure without a price. Okay, if I want to walk outside of this building right now and chant about the Rohingya or the Uyghurs and condemn the American administration from doing X or Y, I think I could do that pretty safely. I don't know if anybody would pay attention to me. I don't think that I would run the risk of being thrown in jail. Okay, and I want to leave a pause on that, because this is a daily consideration that civil society in so many parts of unrepresentative autocratic states, not simply in Muslim majority societies but elsewhere, have to live with. Okay, so that's one. And the second is about representation. It's not simply the case that because these are rulers of Muslim majority states that they speak for the people that live within them. Very often they do not, and do not have the ability, and those that live beneath them do not have the ability to be able to hold for accountability. So I would caution against drawing too many conclusions from the lack of voice, and you're correct, there is a lack of voice, and particularly when it's very striking when it comes to China. But I would also point out that societies that do have active civil society organizations and sectors, and do have representative government, that we really haven't seen a heck of a lot from them either, whether in Europe and certainly in the United States and elsewhere. So I think that we have to be very cautious about drawing conclusions as to why that might be the case. Certainly the Palestinian issue is a very live one. It's an old one, as in it's been going on for several decades. Is not simply symbolic, but is one that is live not simply in Muslim societies, I might add. I'm half English in the UK. I assure you, far beyond any Muslim community that exists there, it's a very live issue for very good historical reasons. So I'm not surprised that it attracts that sort of attention.
I want to someone could pick up on Abbas's question, and I think this speaks to one of the elements of the report that I think Hisham, you and your team have tried to bring out, is that there is a perspective that is the perspective of activists and practitioners who are actively engaged in human rights policy and program delivery around human rights on the ground. And how does their voice figure in this particular conversation that you've curated, Hisham? And also the question was also directed to Dr. Fadl, so I'll give you a chance to answer if you would like. But Hisham, how is that represented there? Because I think this is one dimension that we didn't really fully flesh out in our initial conversation.
So I think that it's a very good point that Abbas brings up, and it's certainly something that we wanted to touch upon within not simply the published report, and there are activists that are represented in this, but also in many of the discussions that were had over the past year or so, people that work on human rights issues within Muslim majority societies, societies where Muslims are demographic minorities, what sort of capacity and freedom they had to actually engage even in those discussions. And I remember having one particular workshop where simply having that discussion was almost a security threat. Okay, and that's something that is unfortunately very potent as an example of how difficult some of these discussions can be. And it had nothing to do with Islam. It had everything to do about the autocratic nature of that particular state. I do think that any of these discussions, if they don't take into account the lived experience of practitioners and activists, then it simply won't have the relevance that it needs to have. It also won't really be very real. Okay, because we can have all sorts of discussions around the philosophical consequences of this and that and the other, but if the real lived experiences of these activists and people who are actually suffering the effects of human rights abuses are not taken into account, then really I don't understand what the use it is.
Dr. Fadl, do you want to come in on this for a second?
I was going to just respond to what Abbas raised is, I think there are lots of practical ways of overcoming differences if there's will to do so and motive to do so. So I think lots of people who are practical humanitarian workers are generally motivated to help other human beings, and so therefore they are willing to ignore maybe philosophical incompatibilities for the greater cause of doing a tangible good to another human being. Unfortunately, I think these the presence of principal differences gives plenty of room for pretense at the level of policy and international politics, so that people can hide behind principal differences to justify what are in fact just, for lack of a better term, exercise of naked power, right? So you'll justify, we're not letting Muslims into Europe because they don't respect homosexual rights. It's as if they're going to infect the body public. Can you really take that seriously, as though every native-born European is fully respectful of homosexuality? I don't think you can, right? So we have to break down, I think, a theoretical issue of disagreement, right, from practical politics and what's actually motivating practical politics. So I think, sadly, same case as religion is misused, human rights is misused too. Both kinds of principles can be used pretextually for very nefarious ends.
Let's take another round of questions.
Oh God, so many
yes,
thoughts.
we did have the Turkey question.
That's true.
Barbara, we will come back to the Turkey question. I have written it down, and we will hear about Turkey. I do want to take another round of questions so we can give a little richness. I see a hand over there. I saw a hand at the back, and right here in the front. And we'll see if we can sneak in 4 in this round. Go ahead. Short, sharp, and pithy, please.
Yes. I'm Max Skelton. I'm an anthropologist, and so I wanted to bring us back to the Arab Street briefly, and I think it's a helpful category. It allows us to think about how a certain discourse is absorbed across a population, and usually we think of it as like a lower class, working class population, normal people. One thing that's interesting about Iraq, and I just wanted to get your feedback on this, is if we look at some of the protests that happened during the occupation, while the Americans were still there, while the Brits were still there, they often did employ the language of human rights. There is no human rights, there should be human rights. If you look at the protests now, protests in Basra against the state, you don't see that discourse. It's like they're thieves, they're liars, they're whatever. It's a more sort of, it's a totally different kind of lexicon. And so that it raises the question that yes, there is a certain awareness about human rights, but there's also an awareness that it's associated with the West, but also kind of paradoxically that it's not there. And so I just kind of wanted to understand how these political languages get bifurcated and are associated with different regions.
Thank you very much. Right at the back.
Hi, my name is Habiba Shbeda. I'm a graduate student at Georgetown. So my question is more so the effect of religious institutions that have on the human rights discourse. More importantly, Al-Azhar's effect on the human rights discourse in Egypt when you have people like Ali Goma giving the green light for Sisi's political dissent, the Rabaa massacre. So what does that actually mean when we're talking about Islamic tradition and human rights discourse?
And just behind, right at the back row. The gentleman with the red beard.
I'm an independent researcher in Islamic studies, Walid Mas'ad. I just had a question, maybe a suggestion for the next project. It seems like the conversation here is focused around kind of either a reconciliation or perhaps a critical engagement of the Islamic tradition with the human rights discourse. One of the things that I was thinking about during the course of the discussion, which was very rich and fruitful, is have we given any thought to the outcomes of these discourses, of the actual effect that they have on societies and for the ability of individual communities or the individuals that make up those communities to change. We could argue in the United States, for example, that the civil rights discourse for African Americans has been going on for the better part of a few hundred years, but yet some would claim we're kind of regressing or we're finding ourselves going back to the same point. So as someone who's interested in to see what, if other traditions have something to say about the kind of societal change that we'd like to see, when will the discussion shift and perhaps will given some consideration to the idea that maybe society should take a different course than the current human rights discourse? As Professor Fadl pointed out, the goalposts are constantly changing in the human rights discourse. So to try to reconcile with something that's kind of not even sure about itself to begin with and is continually changing, I'm not really sure the importance or the relevance of such a project. And maybe we should give consideration to soft power. Most of human rights discourse today or human rights societal impact is driven by power. It's driven by political power and to some extent economic power. What about soft power? What about power within communities, within neighborhoods, within churches, within synagogues, within mosques, and so forth?
Thank you for that. I'm going to take a fourth intervention right here, so if we could have our right there, and then we're going to come back to the panel because we got a lot to talk about.
My name's Aaliyah Crook, and I'm with the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. And my question is, with the rise of anti-Muslim sentiment, do you think that non-Islamic religious leaders have the capacity to help mitigate Islamophobia rhetoric in the United States?
So the role of a non-Muslim religious leadership, and I do want to note I do want to note that there is a piece in this volume specifically around that. Boy, lots to cover. I know Barbara isn't here, but for the record, let's address Turkey first. And I know many of you had comments on that. Who'd like to kick us off on Turkey as a case study?
I would, but
Go for it.
Before I do, and I promise that I won't leave Turkey out, but just in reference to the last question that was asked, a project actually, I'm going to advertise something that we've done at the council ourselves, but a project here with Pastor Bob Roberts has been going on for quite some time, and he's an evangelical Christian leader from Texas. And he's somebody that has really stuck his neck out, I think, to not only express his concerns about what he deems to be his own tribe in terms of anti-Muslim bigotry and Islamophobia, but he's really gone far beyond that. I'm very...
15 signatories to his letter.
Oh yeah, no, I mean he's really quite phenomenal in terms of his ability not only to convene, but also the threat that he puts himself in harm's way in that regard. So I do think that there's a lot to be gained out of that interfaith activity, and in a very practical sense. And interfaith work is often sort of derided as being, wishy-washy and not particularly useful, and it's about like-minded people. Someone like Bob Roberts, but also his counterpart Mohammed Majid, who's the Imam at the Adams Center, not too far away from here. I'm very supportive of initiatives like that, and I think that they're important. So, in answer to your question, yes, I do think there is. I'm sure that other people want to talk about Turkey as well. But one thing that I wanted to raise about Turkey.
Give us something juicy.
One thing I wanted to raise about Turkey is that when we see these sorts of discussions unfold within Muslim communities, whether they're Muslim communities in Muslim majority societies or as demographic minorities in non-Muslim societies, the language of human rights will be used, the language of ethics will be used. But the question that I often pose to myself as we see these sorts of things unfolding is consistency. And very often in certain places, and I've seen this particularly in the United States, but also elsewhere, Turkey gets a bit of a free pass. And I think that's unfortunate because it damages how much we can actually use the fundamental rights discourse or the human rights discourse as often as we'd like, because when we see crackdowns or imprisonment of journalists and so on, but we say nothing about Turkey, and this happens unfortunately in certain communities, I think that damages a lot. Now, I want to be very clear, it happens completely in the opposite direction as well, where people will focus tremendously on Turkey and will be completely oblivious to the fact that they did go through a very serious coup attempt on the very structure of the Turkish state, but they'll do so in order to sort of back their own tribe, right? And the geopolitical arrangements of certain parts of the broader Middle East defines really how they get involved in that sort of discussion. So you see, bless you, you'll see certain actors be very prolific about criticisms of Qatar and say nothing about Egypt, and vice versa. Okay, and the same thing happens with Turkey and with the Saudis and so on. And I think consistency in consistency in this regard is incredibly important. And I'm sure others will want to talk about this issue about Azhar as well. But if I may, just before
very quickly,
very quickly,
and just so that the panel knows, I'm going to leave Waleed's question to our last question because it ties, I think, nicely on where things go from here. So I hope you can hold on there because we'll conclude the session with your intervention. Go ahead.
Okay, so very briefly, the Azhar is a massive institution, right? It's a sprawling apparatus of many different elements. So I find it frankly very difficult to even talk about the Azhar without being very specific about who are we talking about. It's not just one place, it's many different institutions scattered around Egypt and frankly beyond. But indeed, again, this issue of consistency is very important. And I'm not sure that we have a satisfactory answer here because we've seen very prominent Azhar figures express not simply quietism, but full-throated support for certain types of abuses. And I don't think that anybody should deny that. And we've also seen certain selective silences as well. Okay. The point that I would like to constantly bring up is that this inconsistency, frankly, has been across the board over the past 10 years. So I see, for example, certain actors being very vocal about certain abuses that were committed and were apologized for or defended by certain Azhar scholars. and be very silent about things on the quote-unquote other side of the equation. And all of that damages completely the level of respect that we have for fundamental rights. And I'm not, by the way, I'm also not, I want to be very clear about this. These things are not equal. I'm not going to compare this amount with this amount. But the principle is the same. And if we really consider that fundamental rights are important and that the dignity of the individual is sacrosanct, then it ought not to matter who does it or who it's done to.
We got a number of questions on the table. We had this very interesting question about the Arab Street, and I know you mentioned that earlier, Dr. Fahmy, and to what extent is that a useful way of looking at these issues, the issues of religious institutions and the issue of Turkey. Dr. Fadl, you started sneezing as we started talking about Turkey.
Very
Hope it
convenient,
doesn't
Mohammed. Very
indicate
convenient.
a allergic reaction to the discourse about Turkey and human rights.
I just think, what's happened in Turkey in the last, almost 10 years is just a real tragedy. And it's a tragedy with many, many, many actors. I think a lot of people will want to say, see, we were right about Erdogan all along. This was a secret intention, right? Forgetting about, the fact that the EU made it 100% clear that they will never admit Turkey as a member. Forgetting the United States' decision, basically Obama's decision to wash his hands of the Middle East and say, not our business anymore, not our problem, and what that meant for Turkey, right? And then here you have a NATO member whose airspace is being violated by Russia, and when they shoot down a Russian plane, no support. And then, of course, the coup, when there's several hours of ambiguity as to what to do. Following the reaction to the 2013 coup, I think one could reasonably say Erdogan he might be a dictator, he might be a Democrat, but he's not a fool, and he sees who's going to support him. So he's right who's supporting him. And I think it's tragic for the Muslim world and the West that Turkey is now going to be in the satellite of China and Russia, right? I mean, I think to a certain extent we've pushed it there. And I mean, I don't know the truth of anybody's intentions, but I think objectively, right, we've decided that Turkey is really not that important to us anymore. So Turkey has learned that lesson, and it's going to Russia and China, which is a loss to us. I mean, at least in the Middle East.
Before I bring you in, Dr. Fahmy, Peter, could you pick up the end of this Turkey conversation? And I think I'd love to refocus it a little bit on this issue around human rights. Because I think we have seen a kind of an evolution over these last sort of 10 or 15 years in terms of even AK and Erdogan's sort of the way in which they speak about human rights, and this idea that Dr. Fahmy, you mentioned earlier around sort of the negotiation around human rights. When is it important to kind of highlight it, and when is it convenient to negotiate it away? And you also spoke about that, Peter. Maybe we can refocus the discussion a little bit there. And
sure, and I'll link it to our colleague who raised the question of the Arab Street and Iraq. I mean, I think the point that Professor Fadl was making just now connects to the broader point that I was making at the end of my remarks about the kind of broader shifts in world order, right, and realignments that are underway, which make this kind of conversation, I think, very important. Because if we are, shifting towards something like what some pundits call a Beijing consensus, as distinct from the Washington consensus, right? Which has huge cascading implications for ways that we understand questions of the relationship between economic and political rights going forward. I think it's impossible to read current developments around Turkey separate from broader shifts in regional and global order that are going forward. And I guess, to me, what I come back to is this idea that let's stop having this as a conversation about Islam and human rights. We're way past that. There's a broader question about conceptions of human rights amidst changing global order, which is not just about finding whether, Islam, does it fit or not. We're way beyond that conversation. With respect to, Iraq, I mean, what we heard in 2003 in terms of positions that were being taken against the policies of the CPA, for example, to me that's just effective social movement organizing, right? That's people that understand that they are aiming their message primarily at Western audiences that will, and where certain kinds of framings of the issue will resonate more. I don't think the fact that we don't see current protesters in the streets of Basra framing their grievances in terms of a lack of rights as any kind of evidence that rights discourse is not relevant to them, because I suspect that if you pushed and interrogated and asked what lays at the base of their concerns and grievances, it is a sense of themselves as citizens in a polity where the government where there are certain expectations with respect to the accountability and effectiveness of the government vis-a-vis them as rights-holding citizens. I suspect that's the kind of explanation they would ultimately come down to, which to me is manifest evidence of a bedrock conception of being a rights holder.
I was going to say something very similar. Harvard had a project years ago when people used to blog, and so 80% of blogs coming out of Iraq were in English. And today it's exactly the opposite. And so there was a distinct Western audience in 2003 that there is no longer is.
Do you think that kind of, I guess the framing is I think the question. I think it's one of the questions implicit in this report, and I think it also speaks to something that Abbas raised earlier, isn't it? Is that I think at one level what we're talking about here is discourses and tradition and the stakeholders in discourse and in tradition. Then at one level we're speaking about activists and practitioners. But in some ways, it sort of does push us naturally to the question that Walid raised around the impact on people, and I think this conceptualization of the Arab street is, interestingly enough, or the Muslim street, or however we want it, whatever shorthand we want to use, which is all imperfect, as to the impact of these discourses on people. Do you think you could unpack that a little bit more, Dr. Fahmy?
So I still don't like Arab Street, but let's leave that aside.
And I vote in accordance with this.
If we try to understand Charlottesville last year, right? I don't know what they're going to call that population. American Street? Maybe not so much. But we have analyzed them in economic terms, in social terms. When we talk about the election of President Trump, it's been about the Rust Belt, right? The marginalized white man. The highest suicide rate in the United States today is this out of Princeton, is uneducated white males who see the country slipping from their hands, right? But we don't use the same kind of analyses to talk about that Arab street. The reason why I'm talking about communities like what happened in Charlottesville, where you saw a young, educated white man saying Jews will not replace us, is that we need to understand that a lot of these stories, or the human condition, is interconnected. There's a problem, right? I'm not going to say the human discourse didn't pan out, but something came in the middle and mitigated that. And it could be capitalism, and it could be realpolitik, and it could be structures of injustice that affect everyone's lived experience. But until we understand these stories are fundamentally interconnected and shared, and that we can't speak about the young Iraqi man as a member of the Arab street the same way we don't speak about the young man in Charlottesville, I think until we have that honest conversation with ourselves, we might be missing something.
A quick one, Hisham, and then we're gonna wrap it up.
Okay. So just one general principle point that I think is very important here. The first time I worked in DC as a Brit crossing the Atlantic was at Brookings. This was back post 7/7 in 2005. And I had a very interesting encounter that actually defines a lot with how I unfortunately think that a lot of the discussions in our discourse unfold. It was a session on Arab media, okay? And I sat through this session for about an hour listening to somebody pontificate about Arab media. And I noticed that his pronunciation of names of things like Jazeera or Al Arabiya was really quite off. And I went to speak to him afterwards, and I just asked him, how's your Arabic? Now, this is a presentation about Arabic media. And he confessed that his Arabic was actually very low level. In fact, I think his exact words were shwaya shwaya.
Excellent accent, by the way.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Thank you. I will never cease to be amazed at how much language, discourse, commentary, analysis is unpacked, promoted, and distributed, talking about these different populations without knowing the language, often not even going to the places and spending more than a couple of weeks out of the year. And yet that then defines and permeates throughout our entire discussion, and then it goes into policy as well. And I find that very troubling that years later we still have the same sort of frame where we have people who are apparently experts on Iran that neither have been to Iran nor speak Farsi, where we have people who are experts on 22 Arab states, who've probably been to maybe 2 of them for a couple of weeks without knowing Arabic, and so on and so on. And I think that that's something very important. It's something that we tried very hard to escape in this particular volume. We tried to get people who really spent time in the places where they try to analyze, and went to a lot of effort to understand the places that they were pontificating about.
I'm looking at the time, and I want us to move into sort of the last sort of 7 or 10 minutes of this, and I want to bring us back to Walid, your question, which I think was really timely, and I think it had a number of different facets to it. I think one was around the discourse itself, but around sort of the end goal, and where is this going, and how does kind of the rubber hit the road, but also what do we get out of it? And I think that's a significant question for me as well, thinking about where do we go from here. There's a really interesting article in this particular report by a South African theologian and jurist, Siraj Hendricks. And he speaks as a religious scholar about, not about rights per se, but about the ethical, moral principles that are sort of foundational upon which we build any discourse about rights. And Ibrahim Hodeibi also does it in his piece, and it says, well, let's sort of take a step away from the rights discourse and look at the way in which practically people's rights or people's legal rights are protected within the processes of Islamic law. And I think in some ways what they are suggesting is a different way of looking at the entire human rights discourse through the lens of a Islamic tradition, is to say, what are the underlying ethical, moral values upon which we build any kind of discourse? I only raise that in fairness to the report, because I think Hisham, you and your team have clearly thought about this, and it's been part of your conversation. So the question that I'm going to come to you with, and we'll conclude on this, and then we can have informal conversation. I want to thank everyone who participated for your really excellent interventions. I'm sure there could be more, and I would encourage more afterwards informally. Thinking about what's next, where do these conversations go? I'm going to conclude with you, so you can hold on. Where could these conversations go? How could they be made practical? And what's the end result? Is it just, as you said, Peter, another Islamization workshop, number 554, held in some nice venue in Malaysia?
B.
The venue in Malaysia is good, as long as there's some sheikh in the Gulf willing to fund it. Peter, what's the usefulness of this? What's next? How can this be useful?
For me, it's go big, right? I'm haunted by the insight of Pankaj Mishra's recent Age of Anger book. That asks us to consider the possibility that the liberal moment was the exception, rather than a sort of teleological endpoint. And if we do that, then it may mean that we are moving into a time where we have to figure out all of this vocabulary and the conceptual matrices again. And so I think part of that is also going to be about asking whether rights language and universal declarations thereof are the appropriate starting point for these conversations, despite their pretenses and claims to universality, right? And Professor Fadil has already talked about some of the hazards that arise, or the inabilities to talk across traditions that arise if we simply take that document, throw it down, and say, this is the reference point, go. Right? That maybe some of these conversations need to start outside rights in order to get to rights, right? And to start with finding a vocabulary that is around broader ethical and moral commitments around understandings of what humanness is, before we get to, the inevitably more legalistic vocabulary and conceptualization of rights and rights holding and rights claims.
That's fascinating.
So for me, the tagline is, we're moving into a post-Western world.
Right.
And there's going to have to be a reckoning with all kinds of stuff that we haven't reckoned with. And some of it is conceptual and theoretical and historical and post and pre-colonial, and some of it is precisely the insight that Professor Fahmy just offered about the need to be able to recognize that angry men in Charlottesville and angry men in Basra are not actually so different from each other.
And I think the broader issue that you spoke about what a Sino-Russian world order looks like, and whether we would even within the confines of that kind of global order be even talking about rights anymore anyways. Dr. Fadl.
I think, despite all the reasons objectively to be pessimistic, these kinds of discussions are crucially important. I personally believe, and this is one reason that I do what I do, is that I don't think that liberalism as a mode of political organization can really survive unless it can accommodate itself to Islam. All right, it's not because, liberalism's claim to universality, right? If it continues in this categorical rejection of Islam, is ultimately undermining the claims of liberalism to universality itself, right? Hence, the rise of neo-nationalist movements. In many ways, the rise of neo-nationalist movements in the West is a direct result of the war on terror and the exclusion of Islam from the normative project of modernity, right? And that kind of rhetoric justifies not only a war against Islam, but also a war against liberalism. So there has to be a reconciliation between Islam and liberalism if we want to have a liberal order, right? And that's what I'm really interested in. And I know that, sort of philosophical work and normative work doesn't really do the practical work, but it perhaps can remove some prejudices and biases and perhaps lead the way to less pretextual, less fanatic policy making, right? And that can make a big difference. I'm fortunate to live in Canada. I say that I'm an American, but I live in Canada. And it really makes a difference, the quality of political leadership you have, right? I don't want to say Justin Trudeau's a messiah or anything, not by any stretch, but he's a decent guy, and he has internalized enough of the moral values of liberalism to stand up to nativism in Canada, and it's made a big difference, right? Sadly, the Democratic Party in the United States has not until recently. Hopefully, this will. I want to credit Hillary Clinton, right? Hillary Clinton did a much better job of openly embracing Muslims than Obama did, right? Unfortunately, Obama, his kind of cold embrace or arm's length dealings with domestic Muslims, I think, went a long way in allowing Islamophobia to fester and metastasize in the United States, right? In which we're still suffering from that. Not just Muslims, everybody really, right? That's why I think Islam is a really big, important issue for liberals to think about.
Dr. Fahmy, what's next? From whence do we go?
It's for so long our foreign policy has been hedging long-term interests for short-term stability. And I think what we're going to have to reckon is that the lived experience and dignity of all has to come into account somehow. And so that the national interest is going to have to take human interest seriously if we're going to actually understand the power of a liberal world order. But on the domestic level, it's not just Islamophobia, it's the politicization of Islamophobia and the long-term effects of a narrative coming from within the political establishment that even when it abandons it, still has major socio and political and identity effects on Muslims and actually on all minorities. And so what we're starting to see is the rise of tribalism in the United States, right? We are all one brown tribe that no longer belongs. And this is not, I have 2 teenage children. They are growing up in a world very different than the one I did. And I'm old, but I'm not that old.
And I guess the one question for me would be, in addressing this, and as sort of Walid has sort of said, is asking us and challenging us, is it through human rights discourse and through these kinds of conversations that particular reckoning is going to happen?
I don't know, but I'm not ready to abandon it.
Okay, I appreciate the clarity on that.
I also don't think it's an either or.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone is saying, oh, just get away from rights language. I just think that we're all, and in a sense, even though I may have appeared to be saying let's give up on it, I have this sort of fantasy idea that maybe one day the Islamists and the liberals join forces to gang up against the neo-nationalists, right? I'd love to watch that happen because they figured out this reconciliation. And I think maybe something like that is possible. It gets back to this point that you raised about the roles of religious leaders, and yes, the work that Muhammad Majid, Imam Majid, and Pastor Bob do is great. I'd love to see American evangelicals and Salafis sit down together, because I think they very quickly realize that there are so many things that they have in common. And so I think it's not about either or, rights or non-rights. It's about rights, but also the idea that we're moving into an age where a sort of a new type of cosmopolitanism is needed to enable rightsness to be fully.
Again, I can see us inserting those terminologies into a reworking of the "I Have a Dream" speech. That one day the Confederates will sit down with the Salafi.
Yep.
Hisham, you're responsible for all this troublemaking. And the last word goes to you. What do you feel, having convened all this and heard what have been sort of stellar interventions this afternoon from our panel and audience? What's next? And how do you respond to Walid's query?
So a confession in that all of the people on this panel are people that I know and that I appreciate very much, which is why I've asked everybody to come here. And I thank you again for making the time, because these are serious questions to have. So again, I thank all of you for coming. When it comes to this question, though, about I realize, Peter, you weren't saying it's either or, but it reminded me of one of the meetings that we had over the course of the past year in a particular Muslim majority state where human rights abuses were not that big. Okay, nobody there would claim that. They're confidential discussions, so I don't want to say where they were, but one of the parties that we engaged with had been involved in defending the rights record of his particular state at the Universal Periodic Review in Geneva, okay, which happens every few years, and is a very interesting process, trying to defend or criticize the human rights record of a particular state. And he came from a state where, on a very populist sort of level, there were certain parties that were expressing opposition to the human rights discourse on the basis that it infringed somehow on the sovereignty of Muslims. And he was a very faithful practicing Muslim, right? And his main response was simply this, that you may not think that the human rights discourse is philosophically aligned with the Islamic tradition. And you may well be right, and you may well be wrong, and I'm frankly not interested. Because on a practical level, if you were to do away with this discourse, then I guarantee you that the largest recipients of the abuses that would unfold would be us as Muslims around the world. So you've got to come up with some sort of other way to express your opposition to this discourse, which may be philosophically very problematic. But the effects of what you are claiming, it won't impact you personally, not even your state, but it will impact hugely vulnerable people from around the world. And it's one of the reasons why, and I'm glad that you brought it up, why I was appreciative that Sheikh Siraj Hendricks in South Africa gave this particular essay, because he comes out of this moment in South African history where you have a Muslim population that is a demographic minority that has come out of the anti-apartheid struggle with somebody like that who trained at the hands of some of the most preeminent experts in Islamic law and theology of the 20th century. And this is what he chooses to go with. And I think that's a very powerful statement. And I think that as we consider how these discussions unfold and the practical consequences that they have, I would simply go back to that we need to consider what happens when you strengthen or weaken these discourses. Because it's very easy for us sitting in places like this where we might talk about, for example, tyranny in the White House. I guarantee you there are many populations around the world that would be very happy to have that sort of tyranny, because the tyranny that they live under is far, far worse, and they have no recourse. So we need to be very vigilant and aware, obviously, of how bad it can get, but also be very grateful of the tools that we have and the opportunities that we are able to exploit. And I think that if recent history has taught us very much, is that in times of great conflict, there are opportunities that can be grasped. The stakes are high. The stakes are very high. Ask a Tunisian, the stakes are high. Ask an Egyptian, the stakes are high. But you, as somebody once said, history is in good hands, and I think that we have to be very, very aware of the conditions that we live in, the effects of these discourses on particularly those who are far more vulnerable than the rest of us. And with that, I thank you all again for coming. I thank you, Abdurrahman, my old friend, and to all of my friends and colleagues on the panel and those that have come here today. Thank you for taking the time to spend with us and have these discussions.
I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking Hisham, Dalia, Muhammad, and Peter for a wonderful conversation. And to Hisham, the Atlantic Council, for hosting us and convening this, so that you know, if you would like to share this conversation with your colleagues or others who might be interested. It was being live streamed on the Atlantic Council's website. My understanding is that it will be preserved there for posterity. And there's a PDF link on that same page for the report. I hope we won't live to regret its longevity, the panelists and those who are in the room. But if you would like to sort of share that, please do, and please stay in touch with the project, and please feel free to speak to the folks up here in order to continue these conversations. But thank you to the Atlantic Council team for being so awesome this afternoon and facilitating this. And I hope you guys have a very cool, humid afternoon. Thank you.